Why nations fail. Chapter 1. So close and yet so different. The economics of the Rio Grande. The city of Nogales is cut in half by a fence. If you stand by it and look north, you will see Nogales, Arizona, located in Santa Cruz County. The income of the average household there is about $30,000 a year. Most teenagers are in school and the majority of the adults are high school graduates. Despite all the arguments people make about how deficient the US healthcare system is, the population is relatively healthy with high life expectancy by global standards. Many of the residents are above age 65 and have access to Medicare. It's just one of the many services the government provides that most take for granted, such as electricity, telephones, a sewage system, public health, a road network linking them to other cities in the area and to the rest of the United States, and, last but not least, law and order. The people of Nogales, Arizona, can go about their daily activities without fear for life or safety and not constantly afraid of theft, exploration, or other things that might jeopardize their investments in their businesses and houses. Equally important, the residents of Nogales, Arizona, take it for granted that with all its inefficiency and occasional corruption, the government is their agent. They can vote to replace their mayor, congressman, and senators. They vote in the presidential elections that determine who will lead their country. Democracy is second nature to them. Life south of the fence, just a few feet away, is rather different. While the residents of Nogales, Sonora, live in a relatively prosperous part of Mexico, the income of the average household there is about one-third that is Nogales, Arizona. Most adults in Nogales, Sonora, do not have a high school degree, and many teenagers are not in school. Mothers have to worry about high rates of infant mortality. Poor public health conditions mean it's no surprise that the residents of Nogales, Sonora, do not live as long as their northern neighbors. They also don't have access to many public amenities. Roads are in bad condition south of the fence. Law and order is in worse condition. Crime is high and opening a business is a risky activity. Not only do you risk robbery, but getting all the permissions and greasing all the palms just to open is no easy endeavor. Residents of Nogales, Sonora, live with politicians' corruption and ineptitude every day. In contrast to their northern neighbors, democracy is a very recent experience for them. Until the political reforms of 2000, Nogales, Sonora, just like the rest of the Mexico, was under the corrupt control of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or Partido Revolucionario Institucional. How could the two halves of what is essentially the same city be so different? There is no difference in geography, climate, or the types of diseases prevalent in the area. since germs do not face any restrictions crossing back and forth between the United States and Mexico. Of course, health conditions are very different, but this has nothing to do with the disease environment. It is because the people south of the border live with inferior sanitary conditions and lack decent health care. But perhaps the residents are very different. Could it be that the residents of Nogales, Arizona and grandchildren of migrants from Europe, while those in the south are descendants of Aztecs? Not so. The backgrounds of the people on both sides of the border are quite similar. After Mexico became independent from Spain in 1821, the area around Los Dos Nogales was part of the Mexican state of Vieja California and remained so even after the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. Indeed, it was only after the Gadsden Purchase of 1853 that the U.S. border was extended into this area. It was Lieutenant N. Michaeler who, while surveying the border, noted the presence of the pretty little valley of Los Nogales. Here on either side of the border, the two cities rose up. The inhabitants of Nogales, Arizona and Nogales, Sonora share ancestors, enjoy the same food and the same music, and we would hazard to say, have the same culture. Of course, there is a very simple and obvious explanation for the differences between the two halves of Nogales that you have probably long since guessed. The very border that defines the two halves, Nogales, Arizona, is in the United States. Its inhabitants have access to the economic institutions of the United States, which enable them to choose their occupations freely, acquire schooling and skills, and encourage their employers to invest in the best technology, which leads to higher wages for them. They also have access to political institutions that allow them to take part in the democratic process to elect their representatives and replace them if they misbehave. In consequence, politicians provide the basic services ranging from the public health to roads to law and order that the citizens demand. Those of Nogales, Sonora are not so lucky. They live in a different world shaped by different institutions. These different institutions create very desperate incentives for the inhabitants of the two Nogales and for the entrepreneurs and businesses willing to invest there. These incentives created by different institutions of the Nogales and the countries in which they are situated are the main reason for the differences in economic prosperity on the sides of the border. Why are the institutions of the United States so much more conducive to economic success than those of Mexico or, for that matter, the rest of the Latin America? The answer to this question lies in the way that different societies formed during the early colonial period. An institutional divergence took place then, with implications lasting into the present day. To understand this divergence, we must again write at the foundation of the colonies in North and Latin America. The founding of Buenos Aires. Early in 1516, the Spanish navigator Juan de Solis sailed into a wide estuary on the eastern seaboard of South America. Wading ashore, de Solis claimed the land for Spain, naming the river of Rio de la Plata, river of silver. Since the local people possessed silver, the indigenous peoples on either side of the estuary, the Charros, in what is now Uruguay, and the and the Corindi on the plains that were to be known as the Pampas in modern Argentina, regarded the newcomers with hostility. These locals were hunter-gatherers who lived in small groups without strong centralized political authorities. Indeed, it was such a band of Chiaros who clubbed De Solis to death as he explored the new domains he had attempted to occupy for Spain. In 1534, the Spanish, still optimistic, sent out a first mission of settlers for Spain under the leadership of Pedro de Mendoza. They founded a town on the site of Buenos Aires in the same year. It should have been an ideal place for Europeans. Buenos Aires, literally meaning good airs, had a hospitable, temperate climate. Yet the first stay of the Spaniard was short-lived. They were not after good airs, but resources to extract and labor to quarries. The Charros and the Curandi were not obliging, however. They refused to provide food to the Spaniards and refused to work with one cart. They attacked the new settlement with their bows and arrows. The Spaniards grew hungry, since they had not anticipated having to provide food for themselves. Buenos Aires was not what they had dreamed of. The local people could not be forced into providing labor. The area had no silver, no gold to exploit, and the silver that De Solis found had actually come all the way from the Inca state in Andes, far to the west. The Spaniards, while trying to survive, started sending out expeditions to find a new place that would offer greater riches and populations easier to coerce. In 1537, one of these expeditions, under the leadership of John de Ayolos, penetrated up the Parana River, searching for the road to the Incas. On its way, it made contact with the Guarani, a sedentary people with an agricultural economy based on maize and cassava. The Ayolos immediately realized the Guarani were a completely different propositions from the Charros and the Curandi. After a brief conflict, the Spanish overcame Guarani resistance and founded a town, Nuestra Senora de Santa Maria de la Asunción, which remains the capital of Paraguay today. The conquistadors married the Guarani princess and quickly set themselves up as a new aristocracy. They adapted the existing systems of forced labor and tribute of the Guarani, with themselves at the helm. This was the kind of colony they wanted to set up, and within 4 years Buenos Aires was abandoned, as all the Spaniards who were settled there moved to the new town. Buenos Aires, the Paris of the South America, a city of wide European-style boulevards based on the great agricultural wealth of the Pampas, was not resettled until 1580. The abandonment of Buenos Aires and the conquest of the Guarani reveals the logic of European colonization of the Americas. Early Spanish and, as we will see, English colonists were not interested in tilling the soil themselves. They wanted others to do it for them, and they wanted riches, gold and silver to plunder. From Cajamarca. The expeditions of de Solis, de Mendoza, and the de Olos came in the wake of more famous ones that followed Christopher Columbus' sighting of one of the islands of the Bahamas on October 12, 1492. Spanish expansion and colonization of the Americas began in earnest with the invasion of Mexico by Hernan Cortes in 1519. The expedition of Francisco Pizarro to Peru a decade and a half later, and the expedition of Pedro de Mendoza to the Rio de la Plata just 2 years after that. Over the next century, Spain conquered and colonized most of the Central, Western, and Southern South America, while Portugal claimed Brazil to the east. The Spanish strategy of colonization was highly effective. First perfected by Cortes in Mexico, it was based on the observation that the best way for the Spanish to subdue opposition was to capture the indigenous leader. This strategy enabled the Spanish to claim the accumulated wealth of the leader and encourage the indigenous people to give tribute and food. The next step was setting themselves up as the new elite of the indigenous society and taking control of the existing methods of taxation, tribute, and particularly forced labor. When Cortes and his men arrived at the great Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan on November 8, 1519. They were welcomed by Moctezuma, the Aztec emperor, who had decided, in the face of much advice from his counselors, to welcome the Spaniards peacefully. What happened next is well described by the account compiled after 1545 by the Franciscan priest Bernardino de Changon in his famous Florentine Codices. If once the Spanish firmly seized Moctezuma, then each of the guns shot off. Fear prevailed. It was as if everyone had swallowed his heart. Even before it had grown dark, there was terror, there was astonishment, there was apprehension, there was a stunning of the people. And when it dawned, thereupon were proclaimed all the things which the Spaniards required: white tortillas, roasted turkey hens, eggs, fresh water, wood, firewood, charcoal. This had Moctezuma indeed commanded. And when the Spaniards were well settled, they thereupon inquired of Moctezuma as to all the city's treasure. With great zeal they sought gold, and the Moctezuma thereupon went leading the Spaniards. They went surrounding him, each holding him, each grasping him. And when they reached the storehouse, a place called Teotihuacan, thereupon they brought forth all the brilliant things. The quetzal feather had fain, and devices, the shields and golden discs, the golden nose crescents, the golden leg bands, the golden arm bands, the golden forehead bands. Thereupon was detached the gold. At once they ignited, set fire to all the precious things. They all burned, and the gold the Spaniards formed into separate bars, and the Spanish walked everywhere. They took all that they saw, which they saw to be good. Thereupon they went to Moctezuma own storehouse at the place called Teotihuacan. They brought forth Moctezuma's own property, precious things all, the necklaces with pendants, the armbands with tufts of quetzal feathers, the golden armbands, the bracelets, the golden bands with shells, and the turquoise diadem, the attribute of the ruler. They took it all. The military conquest of the Aztecs was completed by 1521. Cortes, as governor of the province of New Spain, then began dividing up the most valuable resources. The indigenous population, though the institution of Encomienda, the Encomienda had first appeared in 15th century Spain as part of the reconquest of the south of the country from the Moors. Arabs who had settled during and after the 8th century in the New World, it took on the much more panicual form. It was a grant of indigenous peoples to a Spaniard known as the encomendero. The indigenous peoples had to give the encomendero tribute and labor services, in exchange for which the encomendero was changed with converting them to Christianity. A vivid early account of the workings of the encomendero had come down to us from Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican priest who formulated the earliest and one of the most devastating critiques of the Spanish colonial system. De las Casas arrived on the Spanish island of Hispaniola in 1502 with a fleet of ships led by the new governor, Nicolas de Ovando. He became increasingly delusioned and disturbed by the cruel and exploitative treatment of the indigenous peoples he witnessed every day. In 1513 he took part as a chaplain in the Spanish conquest of Cuba, even being granted an encomenda for his service. However, he renounced the grant and began a long campaign to reform Spanish colonial institutions. His efforts culminated in his book, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, written in 1542, a withering attack on the barbarity of Spanish rule. On the Encomienda, he has this to say in the case of Nicaragua. Each of the settlers took up residence in the town allotted to him in Encomienda. Put the inhabitants to work for him, stole their already spare foodstuffs for himself, and took over the lands on and worked by the negative methods, and on which they traditionally grew their own produce. The settler would treat the whole of the negative method population, dignitaries, old men, women, and children, as members of his household, and as such meet them labor night and day in his own interest without any rest whatsoever. For the conquest of New Granada, modern Colombia, the Las Casas reports the whole Spanish strategy in action. To realize their long-term purpose of seizing all the available gold, the Spaniards employed their usual strategy of portioning among themselves, or in commanding as they have it, the towns and their inhabitants, and then, as ever, treating them as common slaves. The men in all over command of the expedition seized the king of the whole territory for himself and held him prisoner for 6 or 7 months, quite illicitly demanding more and more gold and emeralds from him. This king, one Bogota, was too terrified that, in his anxiety to free himself from the clutches of his tormentors, he consented to the demands that he fill an entire house with gold and hand it over. To this end he sent his people off in search of gold, and bit by bit they brought it along with many precious stones, but still the house was not filled
and the Spaniards eventually declared that they would put him to death for breaking his promise. The commander suggested that should bring the case before him as a representative of the law, and when they did so, anything for more accusations against the king. His intensity to torture should he persist is not honoring the bargain. The torture him British stratagem, but burning tallow on his belly, pinned both his legs to poles with iron hoops and his neck with another and down. The two men holding his hands proceeded to burn the soles of his feet. From time to time, the commander would look in and repeat that they would torture him to death slowly unless he produced more blood. With that, this is what they did. The king eventually succumbing to the agonies they inflicted on him.
The strategy and institutions of conquest perfected in Mexico were eagerly adopted elsewhere in the Spanish Empire. Nowhere was this done more effectively than in Pizarro's conquest of Peru, as de Las Casas begins his count. In 1531, another great villain journeyed with a number of men to the kingdom of Peru. He set out with every intention of imitating the strategy and tactics of his fellow adventurers in other parts of the New World. Pizarro began on the coast near the Peruvian town of Tumbes and marched south. On November 15, 1532, he reached the mountain town of Cajamarca, where the Inca Emperor Atahualpa was encamped with his army. The next day, Atahualpa, who had just vanquished his brother Huáscar in a contest over who would succeed their deceased father, Huayna Capac, came with his retinue to where the Spanish were camped. Atahualpa was initiated because news of atrocities
had already committed, such as violating the temple of the sun god Enki, had reached him. What transpired next is well known. The Spanish laid a trap and sprang it. They killed Atahualpa, guards and retainers, possibly as many as 2,000 people, and captured the king. To gain his freedom, Atahualpa had to promise to fill one room with gold and two more of the same size with silver. He did this, but the Spanish, reneging on their promises, strangled. That November, the Spanish captured the Inca capital of Cusco, where the Inca received the same treatment as Atahualpa, being imprisoned until they produced gold and silver.
When they did not satisfy Spanish demands, they were burned alive. The great artist treasures of Cusco had their gold stripped from them and melted down into ingots. At this point, the Spanish focused on the people of the Inca Empire. As in Mexico, citizens were divided into encomenderos, with one going to each of the conquistadors who had accompanied Pizarro. The encomenda was the main institution used for the control and organization of labor in the early colonial period. But it soon faced a vigorous contender. In 1545, a local Daigo Gulapa was searching for an indigenous shrine high in the Andes in which is today Bolivia. He was thrown to the ground by the sudden gust of wind, and in front of him appeared a cache of silver ore. This was part of the vast mountain of silver, which the Spanish baptized El Quiero Rico, the rich hill. Around it grew the city of Potosi, which at its height in 1650 had a population of 160,000 people, larger than Lisbon or Venice in this period. To exploit the silver, the Spanish needed miners, a lot of miners. They sent a new viceroy, the chief Spanish colonial official, Francisco de Toledo, whose main mission was to solve the labor problem. De Toledo, arriving in Peoria in 1569, first spent 5 years traveling around and investigating his new charge. He also commissioned a massive survey of the entire adult population to find the labor he needed. De Toledo first moved almost the entire indigenous population, concentrating them in a new towns called reducciones, literally reductions, which would facilitate the exploitation of labor by the Spanish crown. Then he survived and adapted an Inca labor institution known as the Metica, which is the Inca's language. Cucua means a turn. Under their Meta system, the Incas had used forced labor to run plantations designed to provide food for temples, the aristocracy, and the army. In return, the Inca elite provided famine relief and security. In De Toledo's hands, the Meta, especially the Potosi Meta, was to become the largest and most enormous scheme of labor exploitation in the Spanish colonial period. De Toledo defined a huge catchment area running from the middle of modern-day Peoria encompassing most of the modern Bolivia. It covered about 200,000 square miles. In this area, 1/7 of the male inhabitants newly arrived in the reducciones were required to work in the mines at Potosi. The Potosi Beta endured throughout the entire colonial period and was abolished only in 1825. Map 1 shows the catchment area of Meta Supremos on the extent of the Inca Empire at the time of the Spanish conquest. It illustrates the extent to which the Meta overlapped with the heartland of the empire encompassing the capital Cusco. Remarkably, you still see the legacy of the Meta in Peoria today. Take the differences between the provinces of Calca and nearby Ecomayo. There appears to be few differences among these provinces. Both are high in the mountains and each inhabited by the Quechua-speaking descendants of the Incas. Yet Ecomayo is much poorer, with its inhabitants consuming about 1/3 less than those in Calca. The people know this. In Ecomayo, they ask intrepid foreigners, "Don't you know that the people here are poorer than the people over there in Calca? Why would you ever want to come here?" Intrepid because it is much harder to get to Ecomayo from the regional capital of Cusco, ancient center of the Inca Empire, than it is to get to Calca. The road to Calca is surface. The one to Ecomayo is in the terrible state of disrepair. To get beyond Ecomayo, you need a horse or a mule. In Kolka and Ecomayo, people grow the same crops, but in Kalka, they sell them on the market for money. In Ecomayo, they grow food for their own subsistence. These inequalities, apparent to the eye and to the people who live there, can be understood in terms of institutional differences between these departments, institutional differences with historical roots going back to de Toledo and his plan for effective exploitation of indigenous labor. The major historical difference between Ecomayo and Kolka is that Ecomayo was in the catchment area of the Potosi Meta. Kalka was not. In addition to the concentration of labor and the Meta, de Toledo consolidated the encomienda into a head tax, a fixed sum payable by each adult male every year in silver. This was another scheme designed to force people into labor market and reduce wages for Spanish landowners. Another institution, the Repartimiento de Mercancías, also became widespread during de Toledo's tenure. Derived from the Spanish verb repartir, to distribute, this repartimiento, literally the distribution of goods, involved the forced sale of goods to locals at prices determined by Spaniards. Finally, de Toledo introduced the trigen meaning, literally the burden, which used the indigenous people to carry heavy loads of goods such as wine or coca leaves or textiles as a substitute for pack animals for the business ventures of the Spanish elite. Throughout the Spanish colonial world in the Americas, similar institutions and social structures emerged. After an initial phase of looting and gold and silver lust, the Spanish created a web of institutions designed to exploit the indigenous peoples. The full gamut of encomienda, meta, repartimiento, and trigen was designed to force indigenous peoples' living standards down to a subsistence level and thus extract all income in excess of this for Spaniards. This was achieved by expropriating their land, forcing them to work, offering low wages for labor services, imposing high taxes, and charging high prices for goods that were not even voluntarily bought. Though these institutions generated a lot of wealth for the Spanish crown and made the conquistadors and their descendants very rich, they also turned Latin America into the most unequal continent in the world and sapped much of its economic potential.